Welcome to Cyber Monday. I have my co-host with me, Dominic Vogel. Dominic, who is going to be in this hot seat today?
Well, in the hot seat today is Ruth Promislow. She is a partner with Bennett Jones, and she's going to be bringing this awesome, fresh legal perspective, of which I don't think we've ever had the opportunity to speak with some of her background, really being able to dive into the different legal issues that can befall small and mid-sized businesses if they don't take cybersecurity seriously. And she's also going to delve into this whole notion of defensible or reasonable security. So I think she's going to give a lot of great pragmatic advice that our audience is going to be able to use at their place of business.
Yeah, completely agree. It's going to be a really in-depth conversation, very practical, based out of the real world of business. Mm-hmm. She's also going to talk about mergers and acquisitions and doing due diligence, because companies that you acquire may have an active data breach, or they may have poor security. Yep. Also, she's going to talk about the role of commercial insurance and cyber insurance in cybersecurity. I'm going to jump in this seat, and when we come back, Ruth is going to be sitting here.
Ruth, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to chat with Christian and I today. I know we're really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of our audience today are business leaders. Maybe they're not considering the legal aspects of cybersecurity and data breaches. From what I know about you, you take a very practical approach to cybersecurity and looking after your clients. So I really respect that. In terms of, using the analogy of the ant and the grasshopper, are there industries that you deal with or that you see out there that are doing a good job and acting like the ants in that story, or some that are not doing such a good job and maybe are more the grasshopper figure?
There's a general slow pace at sort of catching up with recognizing what these risks are and what organizations need to do to address these risks. Largely, there's been a reactive approach across every industry. We're seeing certain industries now catching up, and they're seeing that maybe they're more of a particular target given the sensitivity of the information they hold. I mean, there's no question that healthcare industries are a particular target. Hospitality industry, we've seen become a particular target, financial institutions. So we are seeing various industries starting to catch up with what they need to be doing. Mm-hmm. But across the board, I'd say that everyone needs to be doing a bit more.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, for organizations that are maybe a little more tech-centric, or a little more tech-savvy, shall we say, do they tend to be sort of further along in their sort of cybersecurity journey? Are they at an advantage, disadvantage, or like you said, there's just sort of just cuts in between?
I wouldn't say that the organizations that are more tech-savvy that are further along, because there's, they may be sort of tech savvy, but they continue to ignore some other sort of people risks, right? Sure. The negligent insider clicking on a malicious link, or the hostile insider. And so there's risks that they may not necessarily be paying attention to. Right. So the fact that they're tech savvy doesn't mean that they're further along in terms of preparedness.
Interesting. And I would say similar along that vein. I know something which we've run into quite a bit, especially with the small and mid-sized businesses, is that a lot of the sort of the leaders in that sector, they're just not aware of the legal risks, both for the organization and for them personally, in terms of not taking cybersecurity seriously. What sort of some messaging that sort of collectively we can all do to make sure that sort of that level of awareness sort of grows up? Because I think we're seeing that at the enterprise level, but not still so much at the small and mid-sized business level. I'm just curious on to your thoughts about that.
Well, and I think that's probably in large part because from a regulatory perspective, there are not significant repercussions. Under our Canadian privacy legislation, there's I'd say a nominal fine of the $100,000, and nominal compared to other jurisdictions, of course. Yeah. But that fine is only for failure to report if it's deemed that you willfully ignored your obligation to report. Right. But there's no monetary penalty for failing to implement the safeguards that you're required to implement. And so I think that's maybe where this sense of security comes from, this false sense of security, that there's not a lot of repercussions. But the reality is that there's a huge landscape of litigation risk. So depending on the industry and the nature of the breach, class action risk is very real. And in Canada, we've had several significant decisions in the last couple years that have really opened the door to litigants to bring class action litigation. and to recover damages for what might be considered nominal damages, so they don't have to prove identity theft or other forms of economic harm in order to collect. That adds up quickly.
Yeah, I would think so.
And then you may have many other litigation issues that can come up, even if you're a small, medium organization. There may be third-party litigation if any third party was impacted by the breach that your organization suffered. You may have lawsuits there. You may have shareholder litigation. There may be claims against the directors and officers personally. And so even the small and medium enterprises do have a significant litigation risk.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Maybe just one more vein thread I wanted to pull on there before we get into your question there, was around that whole notion. In the media, we're seeing data breach stories coming out with, very much fast and furious. But again, they tend to be with large organizations, right? You don't see some mid-sized organization got hit and now there's litigation around that. The news cycle doesn't care about that. Is sort of that data breach news cycle that we're seeing right now, is that sort of affecting the mental psyche at the small and mid-sized levels, thinking that, oh, this is only affecting big companies, we don't need to worry about it? Or is it getting them to a spot where they should or compel themselves to be worried about it?
I think the sense that I've come across from the small and medium enterprises is more, why would a hacker care about us?
Right.
We're not a big target. and then they see the headlines of, the Equifax or the Uber. And so being familiar with the headlines of the big attacks, there's a false sense of security. Well, we're just a small organization. Hackers don't care about us. And that is completely false. There is no industry, no size that is exempt. The smallest organizations get hit with ransomware, and the attackers will demand a ransomware, typically in line with what the organization can afford, because the intruder knows so much about the organization's affairs, they ask for the amount that is actually feasible for them.
They've done their homework.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that slowly but surely it's taking companies the experience of getting hit with an attack to then start calling external experts, forensic and legal, to say, okay, wait a minute, maybe we do have some risk here, and we better bring the experts in to help us close those gaps.
Mm-hmm. So as their legal representative, you represent these organizations. You want them to be proactive. What are some of the things that, after a data breach or after a cyber attack, make your job harder to successfully defend clients?
Yeah, it's, imagine sort of two different clients, one who has done nothing and then suffers a data breach, and then you take another who can say that from the board down, they understood what information do we collect, how do we safeguard that information, what are the risks to that information, how could an intruder access that information, and understand how they're addressing all those risks and vulnerabilities. I'll take the second client because they're going to have, they have the defense to a claim involving a breach is a due diligence defense, right? That they claim is a negligence. If no one can prevent every attack, we know that. And so if you can show that you took all reasonable measures, then you're going to have a defense. The company that's done nothing and has just sat around and had the breach is going to be in a very difficult position to defend against a claim.
So you're talking about due care and due diligence and reasonableness. What would an organization's first step, if they've not done anything, be in terms of what's the first reasonable step that somebody should take?
That's sort of a tough question in that it's the whole exercise of starting to ask the right questions.
Yes.
And especially at the board level, because they get reports from people. Hopefully they're getting reports on these issues. But even if they're getting the reports, that may not even be enough. They have to know how to ask the right questions of the people that are delivering these reports. They can't just, if someone says, yeah, don't worry, we're safeguarding the information, it's all good. Well, they can't just accept that report. They need to know how to ask the right questions. And so when you say what's sort of the first thing that you do, it's really all-encompassing what I would just refer to as either a privacy audit or a risk and vulnerability assessment to go in and understand the operations. Where can we close the gaps? Mm-hmm. Because there are some, you can't eliminate all your risk of attack, but you can eliminate some of the risks,
Yes.
and you certainly can minimize your exposure that arises from an attack.
So I can imagine in the eyes of a judge or opposing counsel, that's probably the first thing they're going to point to. Have you even done that initial baseline assessment?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And on that note, I mean, they're also going to be looking at whatever paper trail exists within your operation. So part of getting ready and being proactive is also understanding how to manage an incident. So having a good incident response protocol, because you may have all these little blips along the way. So you could have years of sort of minor incidents, and then you get to a big breach. When you get to that big breach, if I'm a plaintiff class lawyer, I want to look at all those little blips along the road, and I want to know how you dealt with them, and I want to know what you said internally about them. So you have to think about every little blip in the road is relevant to your exposure years down the road, and you have to manage them properly.
And on that same note, I think you were mentioning earlier there when we're talking about the board and the C-suite, when they're trying to provide some level of accountability or oversight, often I think what we've seen as well is this over-reliance on what their internal IT team or cyber person is telling them, or their IT managed service provider is telling them, and sort of they just dust their hands without doing further due diligence or asking further questions. What are some things that we can give to people who are in a position of authority to ask better questions? Is it that boards need to have someone with a little more cybersecurity savvy? Should they be engaging a third party to help provide that level of oversight? So what are some strategies just so they're not blindly just accepting what their internal people are telling them?
I frankly think that the best thing a board could do is to bring in external experts on a regular basis. I mean, whether it's once a year or some other frequency, to look at the operations and help them ask the right questions. And I think without those external experts, forensic and legal, coming in and looking at the operations, they're at a big disadvantage. And the other thing that the board needs to think about is that it's not a one-time thing. It's not you look at your operations and understand your risks, and then you sort of check the box and you're good. The fact is, we know that the cybersecurity risks evolve over time. There's new risks. As we learn every day, there's new things that the criminals can accomplish.
So it's not something you just do one time.
Yeah, and so if you're not accounting for these new and evolving risks, then you don't know if you've actually closed all the gaps that you should be closing.
That's interesting. And in terms of also countering the argument, I know this is a roadblock we often run into, is seeing this as being cyber risk being a purely IT or technical problem, in which a business leader will say, "Hey, you know what? That's IT. IT does that. We're good." Or that we trust our IT managed service provider. They got it covered. How do you counter that argument? Because that's often a very common roadblock we see in the small and mid-sized business and sectors. And sort of how do we sort of overcome that level of, I don't want to say ignorance, but maybe this state of unawareness that it's not just an IT problem?
A common belief.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's. I think there's some evolution. I think there's increasing appreciation by boards that they can't simply delegate this issue down. And maybe the thing that really hits home the most when I'm speaking to boards is the fact that they have potential personal exposure, and that shocks them. But there hasn't been a successful claim in Canada, but there have been attempts. There's been several attempts in the U.S. And in the high-profile cases where the U.S. courts have dismissed the claim against the directors, it's been because the directors were doing everything right. The court found that they were getting regular reports. They were asking the right questions. They didn't abrogate the responsibility to some other division within the company. They were engaged on that issue. And so unless the boards can become involved in this exercise, I think they run personal exposure.
So let's continue on that. You're talking about the leadership of companies, board of directors. Also the C-suite, the executive management. What is the leadership role in an organization in terms of putting cybersecurity in place from the beginning?
Well, I think at sort of its basic level, it has to come from the top down in terms of making it a priority. Because there's different organizations that they have their operations and then they try to sort of shoehorn privacy into it how they can.
Yeah.
Doesn't work that well. And then you have organizations that do follow the best model to the extent you can, which is sort of privacy by design. So you design your operations around privacy, which is hard, of course, because many organizations come to us and they already have everything set up, and they say, oh, people don't like change around here. So please, even I've heard clients say, oh, we can't have dual factor authentication because everyone's going to hate that. And that's going to be really irritating to access things. And we're talking about access to very sensitive information, and they're still telling us that, that this is going to be a problem. If you have executives also saying that, that's a big problem. That message has to come from the top down that, sorry, it's slightly inconvenient. We all have this issue, but if that message comes from the top down, I think that's incredibly important. And also, making it a priority in terms of budget, right? Because this is so often you speak to a board and, the message back is, well, I don't know if we're going to spend that money now. That seems, why don't we wait and see?
Yes.
And I have a big problem with the wait and see approach because, as I said earlier, I would rather, if you gave me two clients to choose from, I would take the client who was proactive versus the client who said, oh, we'll wait and see. I don't want to spend the money now. Yes. That wait and see client is going to spend a lot more in the long run than the proactive client.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting mentality because cost is a factor, and it's a legitimate component of assessing risk, where you want to protect your employees and your clients and your customers and stakeholders from harm, but not at an undue burden to your organization. So I think that does factor in. That does have its place, but it can't just be, we don't want to spend the money. That's
absolutely. And they're not expected, especially when you're talking about small and medium-sized businesses, there's no expectation or requirement that they spend as much as one of the large multinational corporations to spend. It has to be reasonable in the context. And you don't have to spend a fortune to practice good cyber hygiene. There are many things you can do that are not expensive at all, like employee training.
Yes.
That's not expensive. Or a password policy, also not expensive. When you look at sort of the baseline that even from the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, which has just recently issued the baseline controls for small and medium-sized organizations, when they're easily implemented, and they don't cost a lot, but it may require a small investment just to look at the operations and pause for a second to make sure you're doing what you can.
Yeah, and they're practical and pragmatic. So absolutely. Something which I'm really, I think we're both interested in actually, is the whole notion of mergers and acquisitions and where cyber due diligence fits into that picture. Often, M&A stuff will happen. There's the whole due diligence list, and I think looking at it from the cyber risk perspective, it's not as sort of ingrained in that M&A culture as it should be. Do you see that becoming more and more of a sort of a line item in M&A activity?
I think the Verizon Yahoo issue really brought that to the fore in terms of making people recognize that when you're engaged in an M&A transaction, if you don't exercise due diligence on this item, on privacy, on cybersecurity, you have two problems. One, you may be inheriting a liability. So there's been a breach that you don't know about, and that's going to be your exposure. And two, you may need to bring the operations in line with good cyber hygiene and regulatory compliance. And that itself is an expense that you're not accounting for. And when we're talking about very large organizations, that can be a huge expense. So if you're not doing the due diligence on cybersecurity and privacy compliance, you're ignoring a huge factor in what the value of the company is. And so I think slowly corporate lawyers are beginning to recognize, and companies are recognizing that this is something they need to pay attention to.
Yeah, I think you said it influences the deal value, which can be a negotiation point in a deal. Another area that is kind of near and dear to my heart is insurance and cyber insurance. So why not just insure your risk, transfer your risk, and just be done with it? Why bother looking at this when an insurance company is willing to just take on the whole risk for you, seemingly?
There's the problem with your question is that they're not willing to take on the entire risk. That is the misconception.
Right.
I think cyber insurance is can be a very important part of managing your risk. Absolutely. I mean, It's amazing how it can save a company when they're hit with ransomware and all the expenses that they have to deal with. But the misconception among some organizations is that you can transfer every element of your risk. You can definitely transfer some of your first-party costs, your third-party costs, but you can't offset decrease in share price. You also may run into disputes with the insurance companies depending on whatever application you completed. And so it's not enough just to say we have insurance, we don't have to do anything. That one could disentitle you to insurance coverage, and two, you will still have losses that could never be covered by insurance. And you also have the regulatory exposure that
is your world every day.
Yeah. So if the Privacy Commissioner of Canada wants to investigate your company and comes out, and they're not only focused on big companies, they're focused on small, medium, large.
Sure.
And if they have findings against your organization, those can be incredibly damaging in terms of if you want to be a third-party if you want to be a supplier to larger organizations. Well, that finding against you is going to hit your business. It's going to have an impact. And so there's certain losses or damages that just can't be covered by insurance. But again, I think it can be quite a good tool in managing risk.
Yeah, I completely agree. We always say that you need to treat your risks first, just like any category of business risk, and do proper cybersecurity and look after your privacy, and then transfer that residual risk, whatever's left over.
And you need to understand what your risks are. So to even get proper insurance, you need to have started down the road of understanding, well, what are we trying to do here? What are our risks? What information do we have? And sometimes organizations are just stuck on the personal information, and they're stuck with just the risk there. They're not thinking about their confidential proprietary information. And they're shocked when they hear that, well, there's competitor espionage. Don't underestimate the risk that your competitors may intrude in your system to steal secrets. And we've seen that when you get, and I'm sure you have as well, when you get into a breach and you start dissecting it, you can see these guys weren't after personal information at all. They were after what you guys are up to. And so that's not the kind of risk you can transfer out. This is your, all the commercial knowledge and proprietary knowledge that you've built up over the years. If you can lose it in one fell swoop, well then, that's your business.
Yeah, and I think, small and medium-sized organizations out there are thinking, we haven't been hit yet. So no news for us is good news. And it's status quo. So that's kind of their plan or lack thereof. What would you say to organizations in that situation?
Well, yeah, I think it's a bad approach because one, the intruder can be sitting in your system. So the fact that you haven't heard anything doesn't mean there isn't someone just sitting there waiting for the right time. And you can see that every time when you go in and we do the work with the forensic experts and investigate, you can see that, the intruder's been here for a while and just watching your every move. And the fact that you haven't been hit doesn't mean you're not a massive target to be hit. So to sort of this wait and see approach, and we'll deal with it when it comes, you really are opening yourself up to significant litigation exposure, regulatory investigation, and a loss of business proprietary information.
Yeah, this has just been such an awesome conversation. Christian and I are really appreciative of you coming out and chatting with us, and I'm pretty sure you're our first out-of-town guest. So,
good.
Thank you so much for taking time.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it.
Thanks.
And Christian and I will be back shortly to wrap things up.
That was a fantastic conversation. Dominic, what was your number one takeaway out of all of that?
Well, I mean, I think for me, the key takeaway was Ruth was just legit awesome. I think she just put down so much awesome information that it was really amazing how much she fit in 20 minutes there. But I think the piece I liked most was that whole notion of reasonable or defensible security. I think she did a really great job of outlining some very key steps that organizations can take to be able to achieve reasonable security. It doesn't require you having to spend millions of dollars. It's quite achievable.
Yeah, that's great. And for me, it's hard to pick just one, but the nuances of insurance, it's not just a cover-all solution. There are things that are missed in insurance coverage often, like share price, things like corporate espionage, and sometimes there are those coverage disputes as well. So it's really good that she helped us to be aware of that. Check out our other podcasts on conversationsthatmatter.tv, and we'll see you next Monday.